my name is Kelly Crow, and I'm going to be talking to you guys today about injury prevention strategies for the youth athlete. Quick disclaimer, just letting you all know that the views, thoughts, and opinions that I'm going to be talking about today are from the best available research and evidence out there, and then my personal experiences as an athletic trainer, and they don't reflect the opinions of MedStar or any other affiliation. These are some of the objectives that I hope to touch on today. So identifying risk factors that may lead to injury in youth athletes, developing methods to reduce the risk of injury, and then learning ways to incorporate certain strategies and techniques into training. So a little bit of background about me, because I feel like it's important to know who's in front of you talking to you today. So again, my name is Kelly Crow, and I'm a certified athletic trainer. I work for MedStar Sports Medicine, and they have an outreach contract with Arundel High School in Gables, Maryland. So at Arundel, I cover all practices and games. I make sure that all the athletes are out there staying safe and healthy. I treat injuries as they come up and organize referrals for, if needed, for our specialists. So physicians, physical therapists, strength and conditioning coaches as well. Additionally, I'm a physician extender, so I work in a MedStar Sports Medicine clinic with an orthopedic surgeon. Dr. Marchant is his name. And I work there in the mornings before I go to Arundel High School in the afternoon. I'm also a certified strength and conditioning specialist, and I use that every day with athletic training, working with these athletes, and it's really made me a more well-rounded athletic trainer. When we're talking about injuries in youth sports, it's important to know the two main injuries that we're talking about here. So in general, injuries you're going to have acute, you're going to have chronic injuries. And the research out there says that the incident rate between the two of them is pretty much 50-50. This is specific to youth sport. So acute and chronic, when we talk about acute injuries, those are the one-time injuries that happen. That's that you're running out on the field and you turn your ankle and you get an ankle sprain. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a more severe injury. It just is a one-time injury. They can be more severe because that's also your fractures and your dislocations. But those are the injuries that happen once for one event. Chronic injuries, those are your more overuse injuries. So that's the nagging pain that comes up and it doesn't quite go away. It lingers for a couple of days. You're still kind of able to do your sport and do your exercise, but it just lingers. And so these injuries are more days, weeks, months as they go on. So this is going to be your tendinitis, so inflammation of the tendon, patellotendinitis. Shin splints is a big one. That's the one that we pretty much see across the board with every single sport. And then those are your muscle strains that just kind of don't quite go away. The problem with injuries is recurrent injuries are going to reduce future participation in sports, because obviously if you're injured, you can't play. And then if you're an athlete that does get a lot of injuries, that might make you turn away from sports in the long term, which is what we don't want. We want to keep these kids out on the field. We want to keep them healthy. Additionally, untreated injuries may have a lasting effect on the quality of life. So this is where the kids don't really think about this, is that they're trying to get back to their practice, to their game, but they can also have an impact on their life further on down the line. So this is why it's really important to have prevention, not only just in general, but specifically in these youth athletes and these adolescent athletes. With the youth athlete, there are specific causes for concern in this population that are important to know. So these are obviously young kids, and their skeletal muscle is still growing. They're in general just growing. So when we talk about the growth plates, so those are going to be less resistant to tensile, shear, and compressive forces, which is pretty much sports in general, depending on what sport you play. So that's going to cause them to have some risk for injury on top of the ongoing growth spurts that go on with these kids. Cognitive motor development versus demands and skills of the sport. So anyone that's watched youth sports, I think, can attest to the coordination of some of these kids. So just Googling youth sports pictures, I mean, you've got like one kid going after the ball, this kid's got his eyes closed. It's just the coordination and skill, depending on the sport, is something that you want to definitely keep in mind, because that can absolutely set these kids up for injury. I mean, high school too. Yeah, come out to any of my games, varsity versus JV. So in general, we're talking about development versus demands of the sport. So reaction times, hand-eye coordination, specific to this population. Touching on adolescent athletes just a little bit, because this is a population that I work with. So these are some concerns for this population. Burnout and overtraining is a big thing, and that usually is because of sports specialization, which we'll be discussing later on tonight. This is usually people that are playing their own just one sport year round, or these are kids that are playing their high school sport and doing a club sport on top of it, and that can really cause some issues. Playing through an injury, anyone that's worked with high schoolers, high school athletes, they can be a little bit hard-headed sometimes. So, agreeing with me over there. So they're going to play through an injury. They're not going to want to come off the field, and they might just keep going through it, and that is going to cause problems. And that's where we, as coaches, parents, athletic trainers, strength coaches, really need to intervene. Lack of medical professionals on site. This is obviously near and dear to my heart as an athletic trainer, so I'm just doing a little athletic training plug. For people that have youth athletes, it's important to know that whatever high school they're going to go to, if they're going to play sports, make sure there's an athletic trainer there. That is extremely important. Maryland is really ahead of the curve in that most of the high schools have athletic trainers, especially all the private schools have athletic trainers. But there are still some high schools out there that don't have that, and that's going to be a problem because you don't have someone there who's there for all the practices and all the games, taking care of these injuries, intervening as they come up. So that's a huge thing that's a cause of concern. Injuries in general, this is kind of what the research has out there for the most common injuries. So this is in youth sports. Sprains and strains, so sprains are to ligaments, strains are to the muscles and the tendons. Ankle sprains is pretty much the #1 injury out there for across the board with every athlete, with every sport. Obviously, certain sports are going to have different demands, different injuries come up, but that's really the big one. Tendinopathies, so that's your tendinitis that you're going to have, so inflammation of the tendon. Tendinitis is usually more of an acute thing. The tendinopathy is kind of the long-term chronic injury that you have come up. In general, anterior knee pain. So many kids have anterior knee pain, so that's your patella tendinitis, it's your quad tendinitis there. And that's usually related to growing pains. So again, these growth plates, these kids are still growing, and that's going to cause some compression and shear forces from the tendons there as well. But also that can be related to poor training mechanisms, overuse, overtraining, those kinds of things. So then getting into the growth plate injuries, Little League elbow, that's a big one that you're going to see in throwers. So that's the medial epicondyle, it's an injury to the growth plate there, and that you're going to see in people that either have poor throwing mechanics or pitch counts aren't being regulated. This is going down a lot because there is a lot of safeguards in place in youth baseball for making sure that these kids aren't overthrowing, their pitch counts are staying low so that we're reducing the risk of that happening. Osgood-Schlatter, that is that's a very common one that you're going to see, and that's the enlargement of the tibial tuberosity. So that's where your patella tendon inserts, and that's when you have that's overuse to the patella tendon, and it pulls on the growth plate on the top there on the tibial tuberosity, and it causes this enlarged lump. So that's something that's a good example of something that happens in youth sports that can last throughout their whole life because that doesn't really fully go away. That can cause problems all the way up into high school. Concussion, we just talked about that. It's happening in youth sports. It's not as common as in adolescence, but it's still out there. So when it comes to concussion, there's no specific way to prevent them, but there are definitely ways to lower the incident rate, and Phil gave you a bunch of great examples of how to do that. But definitely don't buy into the stuff where it's going to say, buy this product that's going to prevent concussions. There are ways to reduce the incident and severity, so those exercises that Phil was talking about, obviously helmets, those kinds of things, proper tackling mechanics, showing them how to tackle properly is a big thing. Heading in soccer, I'll tell you that, so this year in football, I have JV and football team, the amount of concussions we had were 3. The team that had the most concussions was girls soccer, hands down. We had way more because they're not really learning how to head the ball properly, and that's where a lot of these concussions are coming from because they have that weak neck musculature and they're getting that whiplash. They're hitting the ball hard and then they're also colliding with other athletes. So that's a big thing with concussions, and again, no real way to prevent them, ways to reduce the incident, but then also this is where education comes in identifying the signs and symptoms and not having them fight through it. Did you have a question?
Yeah, like the anterior knee pain and the other one, they're growth plates and all that. That I see kids saying that about their knees. And that's what the doctor tells me. So there's nothing you can prevent, or is it squatting would help, or just that's something that it's got to go through?
Yeah, there's ways to prevent them, which I get into.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, sometimes in some of these, again, this is a general prevention. It's not going to prevent everything. There are some people that are just going to based on their, their growth plane, the nature of the sport and their training, it's just gonna sometimes happen. But there are ways to prevent it, which I'll touch on. And then ACL tears, we're actually seeing them in youth a lot more. Not quite sure why, whether it's just the intensity of the sport starting at a younger age, but working with Dr. Marchant, he's an orthopedic surgeon, we've had 11, 12-year-old girls come in with ACL tears. So that's also happening in youth sports, that is on the rise. Risk factors for injury. So these are kind of general risk factors. This is what is most prevalent in the research. Obviously, every sport's gonna have a specific risk factor. Every kid's gonna have a different risk factor, but these are kind of the general ones. So muscle imbalance is a big one. These are people that usually just do their sport and they don't do any kind of training outside of that, because again, they're training the muscles for their sport and nothing else. So usually you'll see this in like girls soccer, they'll have strong quads, weak hamstrings. So that's gonna set you up for failure because that's creating an unstable knee. Runners, that's another big one because all they're doing is running in this direction. They're not training out here in this plane, so they have weak hips, weak glutes, and that can not only decrease their performance, but that can create overuse injuries. So muscle imbalance is a big one. Poor neuromuscular control and coordination, I'm gonna be talking about this a lot because this is one of the big things that you can actually work on to help prevent injury. So when we talk about neuromuscular control, we're talking about basically the conversation between the brain and the movement pattern. So making sure that that's happening at a more conscious level. And that also has to do with proprioception, which is the awareness of your body in space. So youth kids in general, youth athletes in general have poor proprioception, but as we discussed, so do high school athletes. So putting in some strategies and some training techniques that can actually adjust this neuromuscular control will help in the future, and that helps with injury. Flexibility is a huge thing. Every athlete has poor flexibility, just across the board. People just don't stretch, and this is one of the easiest things that you can do to prevent injury. So, I mean, and it's pretty much a given. If you think about it, so you have this certain amount of range of motion through a joint. So like if you're thinking about a hamstring, we're just talking about hamstring stretches. Pretty much every athlete's gonna have tight hamstrings. And if your hamstring only goes, in this range of motion, and that's all it can do, when you pick it up to stride out and you go past that range of motion, what's gonna happen is you're gonna get an injury. So flexibility is so important because you need that greater range of motion around the joint in order to reduce the risk of injury, specifically muscle strains. History of previous injury is another huge risk factor, especially as you get older. If you have an injury, you're more likely to get the injury down the line. Specifically with a big one that this is with ankle sprains. So pretty much every kid gets an ankle sprain at some point in their life. The problem is when these injuries aren't treated properly, so you sprain your ankle and you just kind of let it go and you don't do anything, those ligaments don't ever fully heal down and you're gonna have ankle instability the rest of your life. And if you have ankle instability, that can cause knee instability, that can cause problems all the way up the chain. So history of previous injury is really important to know this and to put in some prevention mechanisms that can help reduce re-injuring that body part again in the future. Inadequate rest, again, we're going to talk about this later, but sport specialization is a big thing. So when you're playing year round and you don't have that kind of rest or that downtime, even if it's not, when we talk about rest, we're not just talking about sitting on the couch doing nothing, we're talking about active rest or cross training. If you don't have that, that's going to lead to injury. And then inadequate warm-up cool down is another big one. People just go out to sport and they just do it. They don't do any kind of warm-up. Or if they do, they're doing a stretching routine that shouldn't be done, or just doing like a bend over, touch your toes kind of stretch and not actually going through a full warm-up. And this is actually where a lot of the prevention programs are going to take place, is during the warm-up. So it's a simple fix here. So when we talk about prevention, we're talking about reducing the risk of injury. The question is, who is responsible? The answer is everybody. So it's a large approach. It's not just one person that's doing injury prevention, it's everybody. So obviously the athlete has to take responsibility for their own health and well-being. So they need to be the ones that are taking care of themselves, that are getting in shape prior to the sports season, that are notifying people when they have an injury and doing the right things to take care of themselves. Obviously in youth sports, they need some help, so that's where the parent comes in. And that's when the parent, and good on you guys for being here today, for recognizing signs and symptoms of injury. And that would kind of be stuff like if you notice your kids tired all the time, or they're always complaining of shoulder pain or back pain, intervening to get that taken care of. And then also, if they are injured and they were given rehab to do or were given some kind of prevention thing to do, that they're actually doing it. And coaches, this can be where you kind of step in and do a prevention program with your team. So you can be the one that's taking the charge of this and incorporating it with your team. This is sometimes can be challenging, so if you're at a high school and you have an athletic trainer, obviously that's super easy. You can just talk to the athletic trainer and get information from them, or working with a strength coach. If you're an independent coach or you work with a travel team, this is where it's important to get a network and understand other professionals might be able to come in and help your team perform better. So this is kind of where you can track the injuries that come up. So if you're a coach for, I've just been using soccer the whole time, so soccer, and you notice all your girls are having all these ankle sprains or having the shin pain, or they're walking out with ice on their knees, kind of taking a minute to look and say, okay, what am I doing in my training practices that maybe are causing these injuries, or what are some other issues that are going on? And a good way to do this, again, if you are with a travel team or with some other kind of independent team, find out where these kids go to school and find out if they have an athletic trainer, find out if they are doing physical therapy, who their physical therapist is, and invite them to come out and talk to your team. That's huge, and we're usually pretty okay to do that. Strength and conditioning coaches as well. So just as a coach, taking the initiative to put in prevention mechanisms for your team. And then touching on this very briefly, this was a presentation, a general part of my presentation that I gave at the NSCA clinic that Phil ran in February. And this kind of also touches along the it takes a village approach. So with a student athlete, again, it's the athlete taking their responsibility, but then it's the parent, it's the PT, the team physician, the strength coach, the sports coach, the athletic trainer. It's a whole lot of people that are involved in the care of this athlete. And it's really important that we all get on the same page. So if you're working with an athlete, make sure you know who else is working with them, because that can also be a cause of injury. They could be doing something at their high school that they shouldn't be doing, or they could be doing something with a strength coach that they shouldn't be doing. So it's really important to know who is working with this athlete and then working together, especially when it comes to injury prevention. So just a little blurb on that. One of the main things that you can do to prevent injury is getting a pre-participation exam and screening. Pretty much every sport, usually every sport requires it, every school requires it, but you would be surprised at the people that still don't get one. So what this does, you guys probably already know, it's a physical. So it identifies potential risk factors, specifically history of injury, but then other stuff are gonna pop up on here. So general medical conditions, cardiac issues, and this is the age group and the population where some of this weird stuff is gonna start popping up. We had an athlete in our county this year that was diagnosed with long QT syndrome, which is a cardiac disorder, and he had no idea he had it. Started playing baseball, started noticing some weird kind of signs and symptoms going on. Didn't really have a thorough PPE, just kind of did one of those like CVS ones. And when he went and got checked out, he found out that he had long QT syndrome, which is again an abnormality of heart rhythm. So that's why it's really important, because this is the age group that these things pop up. It's really important to get a really good and thorough PPE. So when you do have a red flag on your exam, you'll be referred to a specialist, and this is prevention in a nutshell, basically. So it just nips it in the bud right away. An important part of the PPE is the orthopedic screening. So this is again important why it's important to get a thorough PPE that's going to have this, because if you do just like a quick physical, that's not really going to touch on this stuff. You might be missing some things that you could otherwise be incorporating into your training. So functional movement, flexibility, and strength imbalances, this is where this stuff pops up. And I have some information for some upcoming PPEs if you guys are interested. I have flyers and stuff, I can get that out to you guys. So going from the physical, which is the first thing that you should do to prevent injury, going into actual prevention programs. So when we talk about prevention programs, sometimes it can seem kind of vague, like it's just here's a bunch of exercises thrown at you, just go do them, that's going to prevent injury. But there are specific guidelines to it that make it effective. So do they work? The answer is yes. Research says they do, but if you actually do it. So there's a quarter of coaches, parents, and athletes that don't do any kind of injury prevention. So that's great because 3/4 are, which is awesome, but this is a large amount of injury that's happening because they're not doing any kind of injury prevention. These are the big three in research. So ACL prevention programs are huge out there. Ankle sprain is another big one, and then overhead throwing, or just the overhead athlete is where you're going to see a lot of these prevention programs. And these are good because you're going to see these injuries, and you can see them in every single sport pretty much. So that covers at least a wide range of sports. So a quick case study. I won't bore you guys too much with this, but this was kind of the beginning of, or not the beginning, but this is one of the hallmark cases for a prevention program. So in 2005, there was a huge case study about ACL because they were noticing that there were trends in ACL tears, that they were on the rise. They were in females more than males. There's a lot of reasons why that, but a big thing is basically anatomical structure. So females have wider hips, wider pelvis, and their angle down to from their femur to their tibia is going to be like that a little bit more. That's the valgus angle that Phil was talking about, so that's how you tear ACL like that. So if you're kind of already anatomically built like that, that's going to make you more susceptible to an ACL tear. There's a lot more non-contact than contact. So contact ACL tears obviously can only prevent so much, but non-contact ones are the ones where these kids are running or they're cutting and pivoting and they're tearing their ACL. I had a girl that was playing lacrosse this year and she literally stepped backwards, hyperextended, and tore her ACL. So these are the things that they're saying, all right, there's clearly things that we can do to prevent these injuries from happening. So this was the official title of it. So this, again, is the Neuromuscular and Proprioceptive Training Program. So what they found was that these were the two big things that they needed to change with these athletes. Female athletes, so the population was ranged from 14 to 18. And what they did was they had two different warm-ups for these kids. So they had a traditional warm-up, which is just a very basic one that they did, and they had a sport-specific one that was known as, it's called the PEP, which I'll refer to as later, but the Prevent Injury Enhanced Performance Program is what it was called. So they split up these female athletes into these two different groups, and they ran them through both of these, and they followed them over 2 years. So this was an example of what it was. So this was in 2005, so again, it's a little bit old. It still stands today though. So the warm-up, they just did a very basic jogging, shuttle run, backwards running. Stretching, so the research out now is that static stretching really is not a great thing to do right before exercise. So, again, it's 10 years old here, so it's kind of a little bit old, but they had a stretching part to it and strengthening, just very simple lunges, brush and hamstring, which is huge with high school girls that usually have weak hamstrings, single toe raises, so just adding in a couple basic strengthening moves. Plyos, so getting in those hops and those jumps is very important, and then agilities, and incorporating different diagonal run, bounding run, different directions for them. This is what they did as part of their warm-up. So this PEP incorporated the main components were flexibility, neuromuscular control, and coordination, which again, that is going to be your plyos and your agilities. So that's your awareness in space and learning to train those movements, because these movements aren't stuff that you're going to be doing on a regular basis, right? Neuromuscular control, we can walk forward, we can go up and down stairs because we do that every day. So that's obviously, we can close our eyes and do that. Can't really do that with our eyes closed. So that's why you want to incorporate this so that your brain learns these movement patterns and is able to do it at a more regular level. And then what they found was at the 1 and 2 year follow-up, so the first year they had an 88% decrease compared to the control, so the sport-specific warm-up that did the PEP had an 88% decrease in ACL tears, and in year 2 was a 74% decrease. So those are pretty remarkable numbers, so that shows that these do work, and it's pretty simple to do. It was just in part of a warm-up that they adjusted, and because of that, they were able to reduce the incident of ACL tear by a pretty large amount. So they do work. And when we talk about training and conditioning programs, this is kind of what we're talking about. We want to make sure that, again, they're not just these vague exercises that we're throwing out at these people. They have a purpose. So the neuromuscular control and coordination needs to include that. You have to have some kind of balance exercise or something, which I'll touch on later in this talk. So balance exercises are good. Single leg stuff, because again, a lot of times the training we're doing just kind of double leg stuff, or if it's not running or sprinting, it's just double leg stance. So single leg stance and coordination. Flexibility, like I had said, that's one of the big risk factors, and that's an easy fix right there. And then strengthening. So having those 3 components to your training program is gonna really, really cut down on the incident of injury that you have. Another big thing is multi-directional movement patterns. So a lot of times, and you'll see it, kids will train, in this plane. They're gonna train in the plane that they do most often, so running. But we need to make sure that we're incorporating other aspects. So again, running, but you wanna have lateral movements as well, because obviously that's very sport specific and it's more functional. And then rotation is another big one that people forget about. So this is specific to all sports, but in sports that involve a lot of cutting and pivoting and backpedaling, but also overhead throwing. So if you think of the thrower, even exercise that people do, they'll do bicep curls, they'll do lat raises, but then there's this whole plane right here that people don't train in, that you really need to train in. Because if you think of the way they throw, this is where you start, and this is where you finish. All that muscle movement is happening in this phase right here, and people don't train out here. So you gotta make sure that you're adding in different movement patterns in different training areas, because this is gonna be really, it's very rare to hurt yourself in this plane or this plane. This is because this is where you're weakest. So it's really important to incorporate these other movement patterns into your program. So the big 3, and then just different directions. And this is what the research on youth sports recommends. These are just guidelines. Beginning a fitness program at least 2 months before the start of the season. Really, it's just making sure that your kids aren't coming in cold to the sport. That goes for high school, that goes for any age really. You wanna make sure that you are prepared to go into your sport. At least 1 to 2 rest days is what they talk about. That is for youth sports, that's what they recommend. And again, we're not talking about, they can be just rest days where you do nothing, where you just sit on the couch and do nothing. But cross training is the big thing. So just doing something else other than your sport, or something else other than the activity that you're doing. So swimming, cycling, those are big ones because they're low impact. So if you're doing a running sport, this will have less force on your body. But also even just doing something like having a stretching day or foam rolling day, just doing something to kind of loosen up your muscles. So again, we're talking about rest, we're not talking about just not doing anything. Because I know sometimes when you look at that, you think 2 days off, like no way. But we're just talking about 2 days off from your specific activity. Okay, so do they work? Yes, we've decided they do. And these are the 3 that we're gonna be talking about because they're the ones that are most common in research. So I'm just gonna run through a couple real quick. And I think this PowerPoint will be available, maybe? Yeah, okay, it'll be on the website, so you guys can access it. So this was an ACL prevention program, so these are just examples of what you can do. This was an ACL prevention program that I had done at my high school that I worked at down in Virginia, and I still do today. And this is kind of a 2-page thing. So what we talk about is, we had a dynamics and flexibility portion, so this was a part of their warm-up. The teams that I was working with were doing just a stand in a circle static stretch, which is not good to do before a game, before practice. So we incorporated a lot more dynamic activities, so just, and again, walking forward, walking straight, hip rotation, so making sure that you're adding in some twisting movements, some other directions. This we had them do about like half the length of the field and just down and back. More functional movements, so just getting your heart rate up. Skip, back pedals, just getting your stride out too, so that's warming up your muscle as well. So dynamics and flexibility, functional movements, and then the strengthening part. So this was where we had them do 3 different phases, and we progressed it as it became easy, or as it seemed like they mastered it. So just 4 basic exercises in each section. We would have them do it for 30 seconds on both sides, and then 15 seconds in between each exercise. So overall, between this and that, and the strengthening patterns, it really only took about 10 minutes or so. A really good warm-up, if you're talking about just the warm-up before you get out on the field to get your reps in, should be about 7 to 10 minutes at least. So the strengthening patterns we did here, so again, it's just getting core hip work because that's huge in ACL prevention. So a lot of girls especially have very weak hips because this was specific to soccer. So planks, clamshells, bridges, that gets all of that area. And then phase 2 was more single leg stuff. So just, again, you want to have a good foundation before you go and throw some single leg stuff in there, and jumps as well, that kind of adds in some agilities and plyos. And then phase 3, the single leg squat, side plank with leg lift, just making it a little more challenging as it went along. So this is one that was specific to girls soccer, but can be used for really any sport, because it just has all the components of the program as well as targeting the muscle groups that are most important when it comes to reducing ACL tears. Ankle sprain prevention. So the research out there, neuromuscular control is the big thing for ankle sprains. Balance is a big thing. So if you do anything at all to prevent an ankle sprain, do some kind of balance thing for your kids. That's huge. Flexibility. This is the one that you can kind of do some static stretching before because it's just a single muscle group. So the gastroc stretch, we talk about just putting your foot up against a wall and leaning forward. The soleus is the other part of your calf, so you bend your knee and that gets a little bit further down. Toe lifts, you have to remember that obviously whatever is from the ground up is going to be the issue, so you need to get the toes too, not just the calf, what's above ankle, you got to go what's below it. So that's just, you have the kids stand and you just lift their toes up, that's all. So that kind of helps with some of the foot intrinsics as well. Strengthening, so that's just your basic calf raises, adding in some hops, again in place, side to side. One of the things that I like to do with my kids is just have them jump in a box, so just kind of doing a square box drill, single leg. And then balance, that's the big thing with ankle sprains, is having some kind of balance part to it. So single leg stance while swinging your leg because that adds some dynamic to it. Functional activity, so if you're a basketball player, dribbling a basketball or creating a lacrosse stick. And then the single leg squat is a very hard exercise. So these 3 are kind of the main ones that we're doing, but this is also a really good one for the ankle because that also not only does it work on neuromuscular control, but it works on that dorsiflexion. And reduced dorsiflexion is one of the indicators for an ankle sprain. So we have them do all these with their eyes open and then with their eyes closed, except for this one. You don't close your eyes during this one. But this helps with not only, so that's neuromuscular control that we're talking about, so not only is it helping you with obviously balance, but when you close your eyes, that takes the vision out of it, and that's where it really comes into play, that you're connecting that brain and movement pattern because you don't have that input, that gaze, so you're really doing it all from the movement patterns. So that's big for the ankle sprains. That's kind of a general prevention program for that. The overhead throwing prevention, so this is specific to throwers, but it can also be for volleyball athletes, for swimmers, for just overhead movements in general. So this is set up similar to the ACL one, where it talks about dynamics and flexibility. So arm circles, just general, getting range of motion around the joint. The sleeper stretch is a really good one for overhead throwers. Usually people will just get the front of the capsule, so it's just like a regular bicep stretch like that. But the sleeper stretch is where you can do it against a wall, but you have them laying on their side usually, and you just bring your arm down like this, and that gets the back of the capsule. It's a very slight movement, but a lot of times with throwers and overhead athletes, they have all this motion, and they have no motion here. And that's where that range of motion, if you increase that, can really help not only with their performance. If you think about throwers, they have a wider arc, but also with injury prevention. Then pendulum swing is just when you have them lean forward and circle their arm like that. So that's just using gravity to kind of open up that capsule and loosen up that joint. Functional movements with overhead throwing and overhead athletes, you obviously are focusing on up here, but power should be coming from your hips and core as well. So you need to make sure that you're also loosening up the core and the hips. So lunges are a big thing, Frankenstein's to get the hamstrings loose. And then going into the strengthening part of it. So these are the main 3 that you really should be targeting. A lot of times overhead throwing programs focus on the rotator cuff right here. So that's usually because that's the main muscles that you're using. But you need to include the core, because like we talked about throwers and overhead athletes, their power is coming from their core and their hips. So you need to make sure that they have a strong core involved in that. And then the rotator cuff, so that's general banded, like external rotation, internal rotation at the side. Bringing it up to 90, because again, we talked about having it in those different planes. so up to 90 here, but also in this plane over here as well, because that's where your strength is going to come from. And then sidelining as well, so that just incorporates gravity into it. And then scapulothoracic is a huge one, because that is where your strength is going to come from for your rotator cuff. So that's the muscles back here in between your shoulder blade, and that is your stable foundation base. So if you have strong scapulothoracic muscles, that's going to have a better impact on your rotator cuff. Because if you just have strong rotator cuff but no scapulothoracic muscles, you're still going to have an injury with that. So these ones are more, so overhead dribble, we'd have them take like a baseball or tennis ball and go in the dugout and just go overhead like that. So that just helps with range of motion. Serratus punch is, usually we'll have them take a band, and either someone will stand behind them or it'll be looped around a fence, and you just have your hand out like this, and it's just a very slight motion. You just go forward like that. It's a very small motion. You're going to feel it all right here. So it targets these muscles here. The no money, I was trying to find another name for it, but anytime I searched it, that's literally how it came up. But that's when you take a band here and you have your palm up and you do this out like that. So that gets all these muscles back here. And then empty can, that's actually a special test, but that's an exercise where you have the weight or you have a band and you're just going up in this plane right here. So we do empty can and then full can as well, so in both directions. So that's really important for overhead throwing, and it just, you need to make sure you target core, rotator cuff, and scapulothoracic. Because if you just do this, that's really not going to address all the underlying factors. Okay, so that was a lot. So wrapping up, the big thing that you guys need to take away from this is getting a pre-participation exam. That is huge, and making sure that it's thorough, because that is where you're going to find a lot of these issues right at the get-go. Getting a thorough orthopedic screen from a qualified healthcare professional is also very important, because usually at these, that's where you're going to find these muscle imbalances, you're going to find these flexibility issues, and a lot of times at these PPEs, they're going to either give you a packet where you can go home and work on it, or they can refer you to a qualified professional that can help you with that. So incorporating components of a prevention exercise into a training. So we kind of talked about specific ones that you can use. Doing it in your warm-up routine, or if you're a coach, having it just as a part of the general fitness routine or an off-season training routine. Beginning this program at least 2 months prior, those are the guidelines, basic guidelines. Rest and cross-training, again, is another huge thing. So 1 to 2 days off a week, or at least some kind of cross-training to incorporate that. And seeking help when injured, making sure that these kids are getting the help that they need, and these injuries are being treated properly and effectively. And these are just some resources here. The website kind of didn't really show. But these are the 4 big websites that you can find about injury prevention in youth athletes and with athletes in general. This website actually has specific programs that you can go on for each sport, and it'll give you programs that you can do for prevention. NATA, that's the At Your Own Risk campaign, so just different resources for preventing injury. Youth Sports Safety Alliance, that's a big one on preventing catastrophic injury and catastrophic death. And then Safe Kids is another big one that's out there. So those are my main resources, and then citation, which you guys probably don't really care about. So that's all I have. Do you guys have any questions specifically?
Do you know if EKGs are regular for PEPs or no?
They are not, unless they are found. If something's found on an exam that requires them to get one, then they'll be referred for one. Am I correct there?
Yeah, we would just, I think most PEPs you just get kind of a cursory cardiac exam, and then if anything's detected, then we do send them for like an EKG.
So what would the difference be when you say lacrosse player, you said you're overusing because they play lacrosse and then they play like club lacrosse.
Mm-hmm.
And I was always told, we've seen a bunch of stuff that multi-sport athletes, that's the best thing for an athlete to do. So aren't they overusing?
Similar, it is similar, however it's a different.
Cross training.
Yes, Yeah, so it's basically a version of cross training because they're not doing the same sport year round. They're doing different movements, different demands, different practices. So that's why the multi-sport athlete is good, and that's not considered. I mean, again, that can still lead to overtraining and burnout and some overuse injuries, but it's different because they're doing different exercises or different activities, different demands on the body. The best is if you're doing like a contact sport in the fall, low impact non-contact in the winter, and then contact in the spring. That's ideal, or something, some kind of form of that. But usually they'll play
Football, basketball, and lacrosse.
football, basketball, lacrosse. That's the one they're gonna say. Yeah. That's a good question. Is that everything? Cool. Thank you guys.